Very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm very happy that this hearing includes legislation that I've long championed, the Open Fuel Standard Act, H.R. 1687. Every president in the past 40 years have pledged to free ourselves from the dangers of oil dependence. And, you know, our transportation sector is the reason why we're still dependent on oil. Only 1% of U.S. electricity is generated from oil, but virtually every car and truck and bus and train, ship and plane manufactured and sold in America runs on oil, and for the most part they cannot run on anything less. And it's by far the biggest reason why we send $400 billion per year to hostile nations, and we know that money winds up funding terrorists in their efforts to harm us. What frustrates me is conversations about oil dependence are usually dominated by calls to drill more or use less. Both can be helpful, but neither is even close to sufficient. Between 2000 and 2008, drilling increased by 66%, and yet gas prices tripled. OPEC merely responded by decreasing its supply, keeping the overall amount of oil in the market the same. So I believe we need a game-changing way to alter this dynamic. My colleague John Shimkus and I believe that the cheapest and most effective way to do this is to allow fuels to compete in every new vehicle sold in the U.S., and that's why we've worked together to write the Open Fuel Standard Act. It has 28 sponsors in the House, 16 Democrats and 12 Republicans, and our bill would simply require new vehicles to be able to operate on non-petroleum fuels in addition to or instead of petroleum-based fuels. And any kind of fuel would qualify: natural gas, alcohol, hydrogen, biodiesel, plug-in electric, fuel cell, anything other than just plain gasoline. And we're simply looking to open the fuel market to competition so that consumers can choose whichever fuel they want at any given price. Mr. McAdams, you talked about Brazil. I've traveled to Brazil, and it's long frustrated me that in Brazil, fuel competition is a regular part of life. Not here, but in Brazil. Drivers pull into a fueling station and get to choose which fuel they want to buy. Drivers make the choice, not the government, not the oil companies, and as a result, when global oil prices spiked in 2008, Brazilians simply purchased more ethanol than gasoline and were largely unaffected. But the American consumer cannot be as smart or as shrewd as the Brazilian consumer, because our cars cannot run on anything but oil. And that would change if we passed our Open Fuel Standard Act. And I want to just say before I ask my question, the United States Energy Security Council, really smart people, former Secretary of State George Shultz, former Secretaries of Defense Bill Perry and Harold Brown, former Secretary of Homeland Security Tom Ridge, former Chairman of the Federal Reserve Alan Greenspan, former Director of CIA Jim Woolsey. They're all part of this, and they stress that we need to break oil's monopoly over our transportation sector by opening the fuel market to competition from sources other than petroleum, and fully support Mr. Shimkus's and my bill. So let me say, Mr. Petrowski, your testimony made references to 4 bedrock points. One was the need for diverse fuel sources, which I clearly support, and another was a concern over externalities. Your written testimony provides more detail on what you mean by that. But I just want to ask you simply, would you be willing to sit down with Mr. Shimkus and myself to discuss how these externalities would be impacted by the Open Fuel Standard?
Sorry, I'd love to sit down. As I stated in my written statement and oral statement, we believe in diversity. I would caution, I would not exclude petroleum. Again, we may be on the verge of seeing ethanol spike for a short period of time this summer if we don't get sufficient rain and relief in the Midwest. You do not want to lock the industry into one fuel, whether it's ethanol or petroleum. Flexibility and optionality is the key to survival.
I agree with you. I agree with you. Mr. Breen, your testimony mentioned that the price for oil is set by the global market, and when the price of oil spikes, it spikes for everyone. You mentioned that in 2008, when the price of oil went to $147 per barrel, truckers in the UK went on strike over the high cost of fuel, and that happened even though the UK was self-sufficient thanks to the oil it produces in the North Sea, and the global price spikes impacted them like everybody else. So contrary to popular belief, only 9% of U.S. oil supply comes from the Persian Gulf, yet the U.S. economy is affected by spikes in oil prices when the Persian Gulf destabilizes. So since 2005, we've been producing more and more oil while consuming less and less. So we increased our production, decreased our demand, and yet American motorists paid more for fuel than in any other year. Clearly something's wrong in our approach. I'd like, Mr. Breen, do you agree?
I do. I think we've got to remember that this is a globally traded commodity. Like many other globally traded commodities, there are spikes and decreases in the price depending on what the global demand and the global supply looks like. I think the key point is the point that you've made and the point that your bill makes, which I very much endorse, which is that flexibility and optionality, as Mr. Perchowski says, are absolutely key. It's not that oil is not incredibly important to our economy and unlikely to be so for the foreseeable future. It is. It's that we need to have choices. It's that we can't be locked into a single, the behavior of a single commodity that determines our national destiny. That's the issue.
I couldn't put it better myself. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, let me say what a pleasure it's been working with you on our open fuel standards bill. I've been pushing this for many years, and I must say that I feel progress is being made, and much of it is through your good work. So I want to thank you for that. You know, some are criticizing the open fuel standards as a mandate, when in reality it's just the opposite. It's opening the market up to competition. In contrast, doing nothing is equivalent to mandating a monopoly by a single fuel whose price is set by a foreign cartel. OPEC and the car manufacturers have essentially told us that we have no choice. We'll drive on oil, and the object is to break that. I must tell you, Mr. Carr, I am really infuriated over the automobile manufacturers. When Democrats were in the majority, and we passed a bill in this committee and on the floor, the comprehensive bill, which we tried to put an open fuel standard in the bill, and were fought tooth and nail. This was the so-called cap and trade bill, tooth and nail by the automobile industry. I mean, given the way that we bailed out the automobile industry, I would think that there should be a little bit more of an open mind from the automobile industry about the open fuel standards. I think Mr. Shimkus's point about how people are buying flex fuel cars, but it's not being marketed as it. So people have it. They don't know that they have it really. It hasn't been a factor in them buying it because it's sort of the best kept secret in town. You talk about estimates of what it would cost to manufacture cars at the beginning with flex fuel cars. Massachusetts Institute of Technology says $90 per car. Former director of the CIA, Jim Woolsey, cites General Motors as saying it's $70 per car. And one expert, Dr. Robert Zubrin, who has run extensive tests, has concluded it's 41 cents per car. In any case, we're talking about $100 or less. I do not understand why there is opposition, and quite frankly, I think the automobile industry is being quite ungrateful in terms of that they would have been gone if we didn't bail them out. And I supported the bailout. I voted for it. I was criticized for it because I think it's important to have a vibrant and strong American automobile industry. But frankly, I do not understand the opposition. If you worked with us, if you don't like the dates, if you think it's mandating too much, I can tell you Mr. Shimkus and I will adjust those dates. We're not looking to penalize the automobile industry. But on the other hand, the arguments that you're using and to some degree that I've heard today from Mr. Hassenbohler are arguments that anybody uses to oppose any kind of a change or anything that's new. If you worked with us, we'd work with you. We'd modify our bill. The goal here is not to penalize you guys. The goal here is to give Americans choices so that choices bring down cost and that the American consumer can do more. We talk about China, as mentioned before by Mr. Dolan. By the way, I agree with Mr. Dolan's testimony, obviously. China's taking notice. It's already blending 15% methanol in its automotive fuel. And automakers there, like Chery Geely and Shanghai Maple, have all introduced vehicles that are capable of running on methanol. And methanol is so much less costly per mile than gasoline that illegal fuel blending is rampant in China. The Chinese have buses, taxis, fleets, and passenger vehicles on the road that are running on M15, M85, and even M100 fuel. That's a cause for concern for me. So, Mr. Carr, I'd like you to answer this. I hope you don't think I'm attacking you personally. By the way, you have a great name for your position. But I'm just really frustrated.
Sure. So, I mean, let me start by saying that, you know, I admire you and the place that you come from, and the fact that, as you say, I mean, you've been on this for multiple Congresses, and I know that your intentions are pure, and I know that your goal is to, again, reduce the dependence on oil. Fair. So, you know, let's take that as a starting premise. The question is, if we mandate, you know, E85 and M85 capable vehicles, you know, does that get you to your goal? And the experience to date is no. Again, we don't even produce methanol as a transportation fuel in the United States. So literally, if every vehicle today was capable of running on methanol, and gas prices shot to $10 a gallon, there's no methanol for people to switch to.
But let me just tell you, that's like what came first, the chicken or the egg. It's like on our side sometimes. We argue against drilling in Alaska because we say, well, we're not going to get that oil for another 10 years, so why should we even bother with that? Well, 10 years has passed. If we had done it 10 years ago, we'd have the oil. So those arguments really don't cut water in my estimation.
The thing about, I mean, I think it was okay to make the chicken and egg argument, you know, 7 or 8 years ago, but the fact is we do have states in the Midwest like Minnesota where there are more than 400 E85 pumps. You know, Mr. Shimka says he can hit one at any place in his district. And we are still seeing E85 usage at basically the equivalent of 1 tank full per year. So again, I don't have all the answers. I don't know necessarily why the E85 uptake hasn't been better, hasn't been what even we as manufacturers projected it would be, but we're kind of past the chicken and egg argument.
But let me ask you this. I know my time is up. I want to get in. Hasn't hydrofracking changed the game here in the United States? We're now producing more natural gas than we can use.
We talk to natural gas manufacturers. Obviously, my guys want to know what to build, or they want to know what direction the market's going. And what we hear is what you're hearing here, and what you're seeing in legislation in terms of the Nat Gas Act. The focus is all on LNG and CNG, and not making natural gas into methanol. I don't know why that is necessarily, but well, I suppose LNG and CNG are significantly cheaper even than methanol made from natural gas.
Well, and then I'll stop, I promise. MIT, there was a study called The Future of Natural Gas, and it determined that the most economic way to utilize natural gas in transportation is to convert it to the liquid fuel methanol. We should stop fighting it, and we should go with the flow. It'll be better for the American consumer and will reduce a U.S. Need for foreign oil.
I want to thank my colleague for his passion, and I'm glad he's on my team.